My name is Alex Keyssar, and I am chairing this session. And I want to say a little bit about how we will proceed here. First, let me extend my thanks not only to Larry, but to the many other people who have made this event possible, including in particular Margaret Mattis, with whom I exchanged 412 emails, and she put up with me over a period of months. The title of this session is "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?" Not coincidentally, that is also the title of a book that I have just completed and that will be out late next spring. It's funny how those coincidences happen. And what's going to happen in this session is I'm going to try to give folks a very, very brief overview of some of the features of that book. And then there are three of the four commentators have been obliged to read some collections of chapters from the book, Charles Stewart, Dan Carpenter, and Barry Burden. And then they will each speak about whatever way they want to take off from whatever they read. And then finally, David Boies will talk presumably about more recent periods, but whatever he would like to talk about on this theme of why do we still have the Electoral College. So let me begin by saying something about the intellectual origins of this book, which was really to ask why this archaic and cumbersome, by the way, the word cumbersome, I think I could prove this statistically, but I assure you I never will, is the most frequently used adjective in the 19th and 20th centuries to describe the Electoral College. It's why this so unpopular institution, why is it still in place? I mean, unpopular, people, serious people, major people, dedicated people, have been trying to abolish or significantly reform this institution since about an hour and a half after it was created. I mean, constitutional amendments to deal with this start appearing at the end of the 18th century, and there are various total aggregate numbers, most of which are bogus, but I think that it's reasonable to say that something between 700 and 1,000 constitutional amendments have been introduced over the last 200 years to deal with the Electoral College. We also know that in terms of public opinion, it's been very unpopular, and I'm sorry to add this phrase, I didn't used to have to say this, it's been very unpopular until recently. We only have public opinion polls since 1944, and they revealed an overwhelming majority, or 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the American population preferred to get rid of it and preferred a national popular vote. So, that's the question which shaped my inquiry. The very fact of asking it and treating it as a research question is also to say that I have rejected certain possible answers which I think are non-answers. One of which would be we still have the Electoral College because it's worked so well and is so terrific. I don't think that's the case. A second possibility would be the arguments in its behalf have been of such shattering brilliance that there is no possible reason to object to it. And the third thing, which we can talk about if we want, I'm only going to allude to very briefly here, is that it's not because of the small states, okay? Jamie Raskin has referred to that as a tenacious myth. It is widely around. The small states prevent reform, etc. It's not true. Anyone who wants, for whatever it is my press is going to charge, you can have the tables, it's just not true. So what I've done in this book is a series of historical probes, starting in the late 18th century and running up through Larry's most recent lawsuit. So that's a substantial time frame, and that's permitted me, I think, to look at the intersection of different factors. There are multiple factors, there are multiple elements in this, and the way in which they interact in different ways at different times. Now, I also want to say one other thing to just define the subject matter and to say something for those of you who have spent less time with 19th and early 20th century, or even mid-20th century history than you might have. The question is not just about why we have the Electoral College and not a national popular vote. In sort of 21st century consciousness, it's generally assumed that the alternative is a national popular vote. That has not been true for most of our history. For most of our history, attempts to reform the Electoral College have focused on getting district elections, not winner-take-all, proportional elections, and on getting rid of electors. Those have been, so the question is not just why we don't have a national popular vote, but really why no reforms at all since the 12th Amendment have happened. And even though we came close, I mean, again, it's not just to toss one factoid out there. The Senate passed constitutional amendments to get rid of winner-take-all 5 times in the first 30 years of the 19th century. One of those years it actually came very close in the House as well. It's really only since the mid-1960s that a national popular vote, and I don't mean the compact, I mean like the phenomenon, has been the major proposed reform. And as many people in this room know, we came very close to getting that through Congress in 1969-70. It passed the House. It was blocked by a filibuster in the Senate. So let me now turn to some pieces of the answer to the question that I posed: why do we still have it? As a historian, of course, I hate to generalize. And last night, Guy Charles, who I don't think is here today, is he here today? He became the 4,443rd person to say to me, so what's the answer about your book? And a question I have deeply resented, and this is, if I could answer this in 2 minutes at dinner, I would not have had to write the book. And if I effectively answer, that means that my last 5 years of my research life have been ridiculous. But anyway, let me try to give you some of the headlines. And they're different pieces, different strands of this. I'm certainly not going to go into all of them. And you can think in very broad terms about them being the obstacles being structural, political, and historical. And again, these overlap. Those are not fixed categories, and they overlap. One, the first and most obvious, is that the U.S. Constitution is hard to amend. Okay, that really matters on at least 2 occasions: 1821 and 1970, when you get a 2/3 vote in one chamber of Congress, and you come within a whisker of it in the other chamber. I mean, that did not take deep research to discover that it's difficult to amend the Constitution, but it hasn't been impossible. And as we all know, a large proportion of the amendments that have occurred have had to do with voting and electoral procedures and voting rights. Second feature is that what we call the Electoral College is actually a complicated institution with a lot of different parts and pieces. And it's the very fact that it's got all these different pieces has made it harder to reform. And let me just mention, I mean, on the one hand, we have, the Electoral College, and yes, it aggregates votes. And then there's winner take all, which is not constitutional. That comes in only really at the end of the first third of the 19th century. But you also have the choice of electors. You have the fact that it is up to the states to decide how those electoral votes can be allocated, whether they can do winner take all or not. At least that has been true throughout our history. If Larry has his way, it won't be true much longer, or Larry and David both. But you know, I guess what I'm saying is that the design of the institution, the details of it matter. For example, the framers, I think, did not imagine what would became a kind of competitive logic race towards the adoption of winner take all when they decided to leave it up to state legislatures to decide. Nor could they have imagined, I think, that in fact the logic that led to the adoption of winner take all was not reversible. Okay, there is a long part of our history which is of states trying to move to districts one by one, and it has never worked. In part because you just can't. There's a collective action problem in trying to reverse it that there isn't in moving to a winner take all. Also, the fact that the institution has many undesirable parts has been an obstacle to reforms in various ways, including that if you try to fix one of them, and this actually relates a little bit maybe to Sam Wang's point earlier, if you try to fix one of them, at least constitutionally, at least through Congress, you implicitly end up ratifying the other pieces. Okay, in 1992, around the time of the Perot election, and it's not the only such occasion, there are many other occasions, everybody agreed that the contingent election system, that the election goes to the House, was ridiculous, and we should get rid of it. But to try to amend the Constitution just to deal with that part would have meant, in effect, reaffirming the rest of the Electoral College, and that was politically impossible to do. So that's, you know, or it also intersects in other ways. For example, it intersects with other dimensions of our political life. For example, who really opposes district elections in the, or not the only people, but a group that opposes district elections in the middle of the 20th century? Urban areas, because most districts are grossly malapportioned in favor of rural areas, and they don't want to extend that to presidential elections. Second kind of factor which plays a role, of course, is partisanship and party interests. Surprise, surprise, you know, partisan hostilities and tensions contribute to the difficulties. This has been extremely true, and more true in the last 40 years than really any other period. But it's, you know, and sometimes it becomes almost comic. Those of you in the audience who are old enough to remember all the way back to 2007, 2008 may remember that in 2007, Democrats in North Carolina and Republicans in California wanted to get rid of winner take all and institute district systems, and the two parties made exact mirror image arguments in the two states. Okay, I mean, the wording is often, you know, identical, but it's the Republicans in one side, and you know, Democrats in California denounced this as the worst idea, you know, that they had ever heard of. And it's also true, and I think Barry may talk about this, that it's notable that the two periods when we did come close to getting something through Congress, not in the states, were periods when the party system was unsettled. Okay. Fourth factor, the temporal rhythms of reform. I only want to mention this briefly, but fact is most people are not interested in electoral reform most of the time. Outside of the people in this room, only John Koza is spending today thinking about electoral college reform. And it's an election that occurs only every 4 years. Interest tends to come when there is a crisis or an impending crisis or in the aftermath of a crisis that creates a relatively short window. But crises, when they occur, also exacerbate partisan tensions, making the kind of bipartisan cooperation more difficult, and they can shift attention onto other linked issues. For the the largest of this, and Ned Foley knows more about this than I do, but is after the 1876 election, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Electoral College, but there's even more distress in Congress about trying to figure out how to count and who gets to count electoral votes and what the principles are. And they say we'll deal with Electoral College reform after we deal with the count. It took 11 years to deal with the count, and by that time, the momentum for reform was gone. And then finally, or not, I guess this is finally for today, at least, not, you'll have to, there are many more interesting things, is the role of race and white supremacy in the South. And by this, I'm not talking about the debate, since Akil Amar is not here, I don't have to talk about whether or not the Constitution, whether the Electoral College was created to protect slavery. The antebellum period is actually not my primary concern here, although it is notable that the very first time that the idea of a national popular vote was brought up in Congress, it was shot down by Southerners. Okay, that's in the early 19th century, who were otherwise in favor of other reforms. Southerners were in favor of district reforms. They were not in favor of a national popular vote. But where it becomes really salient is in the late 19th century, when after Reconstruction, after the end of Reconstruction, during Redemption, and thereafter, when the South emerges as a one-party region. With a large disenfranchised black population, and whites in the South benefit from what I have called, and what a few contemporaries at the time called the 5/5 clause. Right? African Americans counted 100% for representation, but they did not vote. In that system, since you got electoral votes based on your congressional representation and your population, not on the number of voters, white Southerners had an immense amount to lose if you moved to a national popular vote, and they knew it. And they also came to see the Electoral College as a critical institutional bulwark of white supremacy and the maintenance of the Southern way of life. And they fought its passage in a lot of different ways. It's the South that kills the amendments in 1970 and 1979. And I think it's not a coincidence that no Southern state has approved the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. I mean, I think that's true. So that's sort of creating a framework, trying to let you know what the headlines are to which people will react. I can't resist telling you one anecdote, and you'll understand why this one seemed particularly choice. The book is, of course, filled with rich and wonderful stories that you will greatly enjoy reading or at least looking at. But here's one, and there may be a few people in the room who might remember this. This also dates back to 2007, and it dates back to the attempt to switch California from winner-take-all to district elections, which was a Republican endeavor. Many of these things have been Democratic endeavors, but this one was a Republican endeavor, and the reason was kind of obvious. That California had 50 electoral votes, but there were 22 congressional districts that were Republican. If you could switch to a district election, the Republicans would pick up 20 it would be a net shift of 40 electoral votes. This was a big deal. And a campaign gets underway, and there's a sort of leading California Republican election lawyer who is working on this, and they're trying to raise money to get the signatures. And then there's this moment which sort of freezes the thing for a while, and I think really is part of what kills it, which is suddenly the two heads of this movement, which is in the signature gathering stage, resign. Both Republicans, obviously. Why do they resign? Because it's come out that the single largest contribution that they have received has come from a nonprofit somewhere in the Midwest. I think maybe it was Wisconsin, in a small town. And when the press and they had tried to find out where the money actually came from, they were stonewalled. It turned out that the nonprofit that made this major contribution to their endeavor had been incorporated, or whatever you do with nonprofits, you formed officially the day before it made the contribution. In other words, it's formed by a small town lawyer who will not say where the money's coming from, and then it makes this big contribution. So there's so they resign. They say, we're not going to do this if we don't know. So then there is an investigation. Okay, now we could do a test of hands, but I'll just tell you the answer. Where did the money come from? A very rich and close ally of Rudolph Giuliani's, who was a presidential aspirant at the time. And with that, let me turn this over. And I think the agreed sequence was that Charles Stewart of MIT was going to speak first. Charles.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And I have the unfortunate reality of having to follow Alex. That's always a hard thing to do. But I also want to thank him for giving me a couple of chapters to read that are full of interesting and rich and detailed accounts of legislation in a couple of periods in American history. And as a political scientist who studies Congress historically, I found it really, really great to read. One of the reasons, by the way, before getting into the substance, that I liked reading these chapters and reading this book, and this is more for the students in the room, is that one of his first footnotes is to Herman Ames's, I guess it was a dissertation originally or something like that, which is basically a one damn thing after the other catalog of every, up until the 1890s or so, every constitutional amendment that had ever been proposed. And it just reminds us that back in that period, you could get a dissertation just by writing books that were just one damn thing after the other, lists about electoral practices in the United States, legislative practices wherever, whatever you wanted to do, just categorizing and listing was all you needed to do to get a dissertation or to get an award-winning publication. And it's a great book, by the way, as many of these are. They like to say that history is a foreign country, and by reading these books, you get a sense about what the possibilities are within American history. You don't have to go to other countries to see that there are other aspects possible in the electoral process. So Alex hates to generalize. I'm a political scientist. In fact, 3 of the 4 of us are political scientists. We love to generalize. And so I'm afraid to say that one of the things that I did after having read what I read was to try to ask, well, what's general about these cases? And I have to say, actually, what I came up with is fairly close to what Alex just said. And so, although he hates to generalize, I think there are some general things to be said. And so, let me just state what I think kind of the general takeaways are, at least from the 2 chapters. And I'll tell you about those chapters in just a second. And then a few words about the implications for the current day. The 2 chapters, by the way, are deep dives into, first of all, the period where we probably came the closest to changing the Electoral College, the era of good feeling. This is a time when the Senate actually did get 2/3 vote to forward a constitutional amendment. The House did not follow suit for a variety of reasons. But there's basically a decade and a half of pretty constant contestation over that. So that's one of the chapters. The second chapter moves from the 19th into the 20th century, ending with an account of the so-called Lodge Gossett amendment, which again, passed in the Senate and then went down in flames in the House for reasons that I think are really important for the politics of the period. And so those are the 2 kind of cases, if you will, that I'm responding to. And so as a political scientist, and one who studies Congress and is a bit of a rat choice guy, in trying to figure out what to make of this and to generalize, I asked, first of all, well, what are the primitives of trying to change the Constitution around the Electoral College? And by the way, as a footnote, I think these 2 panels mesh well together, because Ned's panel in his book is, I would say, more of a normative claim about what should be, whereas Alex's book is primarily focusing on kind of the empirical case about why not. And so these kind of two, so this is kind of, the book is about, well, why not? And, to try to package the argument together in terms of political science primitives, the first is, and this has been said many times before in different ways, the status quo regime is really, really important. You can't, and that's the regime you have to beat. And that regime is, first of all, a constitutional system that allows the states to do whatever they want to do, pretty much. And that the second major part of that regime is that because the states, meaning usually the legislatures, maybe referendum, maybe the governor's in there, but certainly it's called the state legislatures. The state legislatures are, the state legislators are elected and respond to constituents. And what do those state constituents care about? First of all, they don't care about the Electoral College, by and large. It's a low salience event, and as Alex was mentioning, others have mentioned, every now and then there's a crisis. But there's always another crisis. So Electoral College is rarely salient at the state level. It's rarely salient in a lot of states for very long. That's thing number one. On the other hand, so here's an interesting thing that I got thinking about in reading these chapters. So members of the state legislature generally are not thinking about the electoral regime for selecting electors, except they are political elites, and they are much more likely to care about the state of parties and the power of parties, and therefore there is something about state legislators being responsible for choosing the systems within the states that kind of nationalizes the system. So it makes the choice not just one state at a time, but eventually all state legislators who are Democrats are going to think about this the same way, and all state legislators who are Republicans are going to think about this in the same way, with important exceptions. So there is a certain nationalizing dynamic in this being with state legislators. At the same time, they do have to deal with the fact that their constituents don't particularly care about parties. And to some degree, that ends up being a little bit of a break against pure partisan shenanigans or motivations, and you do see that from time to time. There are important breaks within both the Democrats and Republicans and state legislatures. But nonetheless, we have state legislatures that help to define what the status quo regime. And then we have the elements for institutional change that are trying to change the status quo regime. And the first thing I would say, this is an entirely political sciencey sort of thing, but I think it has to be said, we got public choice instability, okay? And by which I mean that for people who study any sort of decision process, when you have a multidimensional problem with more than two actors, anything can happen. And there are two important features here that come from the theory of social choice. The first is that virtually any policy choice will have a majority who doesn't like it. You will always have dissatisfaction. And so it's not surprising that there's constant dissatisfaction with the Electoral College. But it's not just that. The problem is, and again, this is what Alex was pointing to, this is a gazillion dimensional problem. It's just not a couple of things, but districts versus winner take all, if districts, whether electors or not, if proportional, whether integer proportional or not, popular versus state legislature, plurality versus majority, if a majority, how to resolve if you have a plurality and you have to come to majority. So I don't know how many binary choices there are in there, but there's probably like 32 discrete possibilities that you could light on if you wanted to move to something else. And one of the things, not to get into cases, but one of the things that seems to emerge is, again, at any given time when there is a crisis or general dissatisfaction with the Electoral College, that the opponents end up cannibalizing each other because it's very hard to come to the one of the 32 possibilities that's going to get the majority against the status quo. Okay, so that's kind of the choice space. The decision arena being Congress, it's actually the parameters there, and I won't say much more, are similar to the state legislatures, by which I'll just, repeat, low salience of the issues. There are things that will get them reelected more likely than worrying about the Electoral College. And that the lesser interest among their constituents for partisan shenanigans sometimes causes people like Lodge or others to take a stand that's contrary to the prevailing wisdom. The other important element for institutional change, again, it's been mentioned before, but it's a constitutional question by and large. And so we have supermajority requirements. And my reading of these cases suggests that it's really an insuperable problem. And I'll just offer a couple of comments that aren't in the book, but I think they're consistent with the book. One comes about by asking the question, how do we explain regular Senate supermajorities with House inaction in the antebellum period? That seems to be a puzzle. And a couple of things to be said about that. First of all, that one of the things be interesting, I don't know if Alex has thought about this, but particularly in the antebellum period, some senators cared about what the state legislature said, and many of it seems that a lot of the kind of motive forces behind some of these proposals were petitions from state legislatures or instructions to U.S. senators. During this period, there was an ambiguity about the status of state legislative instructions to senators. Eventually, that got resolved. Senators started just ignoring them. But during this period, they didn't, and senators had principled responses, and usually they would go along with instructions. I would note that these 2/3 majorities were by the skin of the teeth in the Senate. And I wonder to what degree did the instructions in the Senate push things over the top that would not have, and so in the House you don't have instructions. And so it might very well be that not only were these 2/3 majorities by the skin of the teeth, it might have been due to another aspect of congressional elections in the antebellum period, which is this thing about instructions. Final thing I'll say, just related to the book, and this gets a little bit into the cases. I like the book because the cases looking at Electoral College reform tell us things about, in general, politics during this period. In the antebellum period, particularly when it comes to election rules, both the nation and the states were trying to figure out election rules. It wasn't just the Electoral College. So, as has been mentioned, is particularly around the first panel, the original Section 2 regime, and then later, well, original Section 2 regime was as close as we ever get to spitballing constitutional possibilities, from my reading of it. And although Ned makes an important case in his book that the 12th Amendment was much more thoughtful and reflective on practice and theory than the original regime was, still there was a lot of experimentation during this time, and that's certainly the case. That's one thing to be said about the case. Second thing, I think it needs to be remembered that even the 12th Amendment passed with the barest of supermajorities, right? In fact, it was exactly 2/3 in the House and by just a vote or two in the Senate. It's also the case that they were almost exactly party line votes. I mean, there's a couple of exceptions, but basically, let's call them party line votes. So that's kind of problematic. I mean, that's especially problematic for me thinking about the possibility of constitutional amendments moving forward. Again, as Ned mentioned earlier, it's not the case, blatantly, it's clearly not the case, that it was widely concluded by the election of 1800 that the original regime was a disaster. Federalists were fine with it. You know, they would have stayed with it, and they almost made it so that we could have still had the original regime to this day. Another thing is, and I've promised to say a little bit about this, but you know, states were experimenting with all sorts of things during this period. In New England, we had up into the 1840s. For instance, I mean, not only did Massachusetts have district election of electors, but you know, we had these really weird majority requirements for the election of governors and of state legislators, et cetera. And so there just was a willingness to experiment during this period. Now, overall, there was a narrowing of the political space, nonetheless. I mean, I think this is just an interesting period to look at in America in general for looking at willingness to experiment. With respect to the mid-20th century case, this is the Lodge Gossett period. The one thing that I would point out there, and I think it's kind of a social choice, political science point by way of Bill Riker. Now, William Riker, who kind of brought social choice sorts of things to political science, had this argument late in his life about the heristhetics of political discourse, trying to change the dimensionality of political fights. And the Lodge Gossett case, I think, is a great example, wherein when the case was in the Senate, it looked to be led by Lodge, looked to be a coalition that was trumpeting kind of the progressive possibilities if one were to move toward a popular vote. Unfortunately for them, they were married at the hip to this guy Gossett, a flaming anti-Semite. And so once the case got into the House, the nature of the debate changed dramatically, and it lost. Now, this was not strategic. Gossett didn't make this choice for the purposes of killing his reform, but it does point out kind of the difficulties of kind of the rhetorical framing of these issues during this period. And one of the last times we had a chance to make a change, just the framing of the issue killed it. So what does all this say to get today? Just a couple of quick things at the to conclude. One is, well, the main thing I guess I would just say is that I end up being kind of a reform curmudgeon and a skeptic, having read Alex's book, I'm afraid to say. And I don't know if that's the intention. But even in times in this country's history where the issue of the Electoral College and its deficiencies have been more than a kind of a passing interest among the chattering classes, in the end of the day, at the national level, it's really been difficult, if not impossible, to do anything. It does push things into the states where there's a possibility for experimentation. And the book is not about the states, and so I really can't say anything about the states. But at the national level, at least I come away, at least from the chapters that I read, not entirely sanguine about the ability to address these things through constitutional amendment or anything of the sort. So, thanks.
Thank you, Charles. I think Dan Carpenter is up next.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks to Larry, thanks to Margaret. I'm also following two scholars whose books I've taught to undergraduates and graduate students alike, I believe, at different times. Charles's book on budget reform politics in the House in the late 19th century, and Alex's book on the right to vote. So you can pay me later with the six-pack for the contributions to the college fund. Look, I think this book is going to be a landmark. It shows just how contingent and contested our present-day institutions are, from district systems and their possibility to the precise nature of the Electoral College and the way it functions, to the possibility, actuality of faithless electors itself. And showing how a set of near misses have produced not simply the Electoral College, again, as it's described, but the particular form of system of aggregation that we know. We get the contested nature of the Senate, of the Kennedy election. I'd forgotten that. The near miss of the Schiller resolution in the Senate, the contingency brought on by the Carter-Ford contest, and to me, all of these are narrated in ways that bring lucidity to a remarkably unclear subject. So by this book, even without any connection to Rudolph Giuliani.
I think we can stop the session right here.
Yeah, I do want to say it's remarkable that you brought up Giuliani without mentioning small country with which he's currently associated, which happens to have funded also one of the very largest proportional size endowments at Harvard, which is the Ukraine Center. I posit no association whatsoever between said individual and said center, but it's worth noting. So let me begin with a couple of historical notes and then a general counterfactual. The first is, for those of you who study historical political science, Congress, political history, I think we're in need of a more academic biography or study of Manny Seller. He reappears here again as the primary author. He's the Brooklyn congressman, New York Democrat. He's the primary author of the resolution to abolish the Electoral College in Chapter 5. I'm thinking of the kind of work that if you followed Julian Zellizer's work on, say, Wilbur Mills, that's the kind of thing we need of Seller. But arguably, I think you could make the case that Seller is even more important across the mid-20th century than Wilbur Mills. He personifies the urban liberals' commitment to civil rights, crucial alliances with African-American politicians. He liberalizes immigration laws. He assisted and helped write crucial portions of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And here he is again, right, reforming potentially our electoral systems. We have an autobiography of him, if anybody knows. It's that you can't leave, or you don't leave Brooklyn, right? He was born in Brooklyn, passed away in Brooklyn his whole life. And I was about to say, I was checking my notes this morning, I said, we have all these other great biographies of prominent Jewish members of Congress. It turns out that's not true, actually. I'm looking for Javits, I'm looking for Strauss, Isidor Strauss, a whole bunch of others. But set aside, we need a good biography, an academic study of Seller and his influence. It's simply monumental at this period of the 20th century. And I think it would be a great addition to a number of bookshelves. Second thing I want to note, we get this moment in the 1960s when the following organizations are collaborating. The ABA, American Bar Association, well known to folks in the room, the AFL-CIO, the UAW, and the Chamber of Commerce, right? It's one of that old Sesame Street, which one of these doesn't belong, right? And we're in this moment in the mid-20th century when my dearly departed colleague, departed to Berkeley, not to heaven, Paul Pearson likes to say, well, business was liberal then because they had to be, because the New Deal and Democrats and their electoral domination forced them into a more moderate posture. Whatever the reasons for it, business did have a more moderate posture at the time. And so the kind of constellation of interest groups and coalitions that create that moment simply is no longer with us. And I think that's also deserves more study. There are people writing on that, the transformation of the business coalition in American politics, its tethering to a wing of the Republican Party. Things like that. But, of course, today, what's the chamber? It's Tom Donahue, right? Along with, whenever I see him speak on Meet the Press, I think of him and, Sean Hannity and Brett Kavanaugh, three Irishmen who make my Irish grandmother, roll daily in her grave. But that's another conversation altogether. So, this is a conference in part about counterfactuals. We're asking what would 2016, 2000, what would an alternative set of incentives look like were our electoral system to be organized differently? And I want to advance a reading of Alex's book, especially in its later chapters, in which one counterfactual in particular stands out. And so let me introduce that counterfactual by way of my daughter, who we were arguing over Democratic candidates for president, and she was making the case for someone other than Joe Biden. And the remark came out sort of like the following: besides, Delaware isn't a real state. This remark has now become famous in the Carpenter family lore, so much so that it gets repeated by people who've never been to Delaware and who might possibly misspell it where it puts them in a spelling bee. But let's run that. We're in part here because of the phenomenon of Donald Trump. It may not be well known. I think it's reasonably well known. You could redraw two state lines, put the Panhandle in Alabama or Georgia, and put Superior State, which has been a proposal that existed since the 1840s or 1850s, either make it its own state or attach it to Wisconsin, and Hillary Clinton wins the Electoral College in 2016. Right? So the departure of the Electoral College from the popular vote depends very heavily upon the construction, the deeply artificial and political construction of state boundaries. So I'm going to oversimplify in what's about to follow, but let me say that the two principal sources of non-proportional statehood admissions in American history come from two eras of sectional conflict. The first is the so-called balance rule that characterized what you can loosely call the antebellum republic, where slave states were admitted to offset those deemed free. And the second was the Republican Senate stacking work of the late 19th century, for which the authoritative treatment has actually been written by Charles Stewart, a fantastic article in Studies in American Political Development, which I've also taught. In the first case, it's simple enough to note that by 1860, the population of post-1789 slave states was systematically below that of free states by a factor of half or more, and the easiest way to do this is look at the size of the House delegations at the time. Simply much larger in the North, smaller in the South. For the second, it's sufficient to note that a number of states admitted to the Senate, or to the Union, excuse me, in the 1860s, would not, under the usual population and economic development ratios, have attained statehood properly, according to that counterfactual, until the late 19th century. Wyoming, 1970, 1980? Mm-hmm. Roughly, right? So the jokes about Wyoming earlier, they're somewhat appropriate, right? Note that two of the principal Western states and two of the most liberal today, Oregon and California, are actually already in the Union by 1860. So what are the implications for Alex's argument? Well, a lot of the near misses here, I'm going to argue, concern those states and the fact that they're in the Union at the time. So let me just focus on one, which is the House vote on the Schiller resolution and the Senate failure to produce closure in the debate. Alex, in the House vote, gives this summary. He says a majority of votes against the resolution came from Southern Democrats, with most of the rest cast by conservative Republicans, particularly from the mountain and plain states. Once you get to the Senate closure vote, you start taking a look at, and Sam Wang earlier said, like, why not one Dakota as opposed to two? So I just went through Alex's table, and suppose you just did the following: merge the Dakotas and Nebraska into one state, do something similar with Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. You basically get the 2/3 majority you need. There are different ways of computing this to do this. Now, these counterfactuals can be run a million ways from Wednesday. I get that. The other thing you can say is, well, wait a minute, Dan, what about all the interesting progressive politicians that come out of this period in the mid-19th century? McGovern from South Dakota, Mike Mansfield from Montana. I would argue those are the exceptions that prove the rule, that these are largely conservative aggregations and actors in 20th century politics. So let me be very clear that I am not interested in advancing any kind of functionalist rendering of a deep relationship between the Electoral College and the particular path that statehood admissions have taken. Part of the reason we're here is the same reason that the Reconstruction Amendments and land-grant colleges are here, namely that the Rump Congress of the 1860s, combined with what Republicans saw as a unique opportunity, gave that Western push for statehood admissions. They just had the votes. But let's confront the elephant, or if you will, the donkey in the room, since we're talking about counterfactuals and talking about one that's actually quite plausible. The future of any sort of reform, whether it's the one favored by Ned or whether it's the one favored by Article 5 enthusiasts, depends upon Democrats having cross-branch legislative power in the coming years, not so much the state compact, although we can talk about particular coalitions there. There was a time when the rural tilt of the US Senate actually paid some modest progressive dividends, namely in the majuscule P populist and majuscule P progressive eras. So if you think about the 16th through 19th Amendments or the important economic regulation that came out of that period, it's pretty clear that a lot of that owes to agrarian voting patterns and representatives. Elizabeth Sanders, in her book, The Roots of Reform, has tallied up a lot of the votes, particularly from those areas of grain farming that weren't dependent, like dairy, on local markets. They were more subject to international trade flows. But for now, for the moment, for any proponent either of electoral transformation or other egalitarian programs, there's no such delicious reality, right? Any more egalitarian initiative has to place political reform high on the agenda. And in my reading, it needs to start with statehood admissions, not merely for reasons of political pragmatism, but I would argue for reasons of political equality, which gets back to Alex's last point about race. Ending the denial of full representation to the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico and its non-white majorities would be one element of that political equality. But of course, there are others having to do with how it would change the political calculus, not only for votes in the Senate, and think about further statehood admissions, but how it would change the ratification ballgame. And I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Jim. Barry?
Well, I had the pleasure of reading a couple of chapters from the book from essentially the early 1800s until the 1970s, where we end with a vote of 84% of the House in favor of replacing the Electoral College with a national popular vote, and 54% of the Senate doing the same. Not enough for the 2/3 required, but one of many cases that were frustrating and pleasurable to read about at the same time. How do we come to the precipice of reform and not make it happen? Especially in this long arc of American history where the movement has been in the direction of greater suffrage, a greater belief in democracy, greater involvement of the federal government in elections, and a greater belief, I think, in popular rule. The Electoral College is the main holdout from all of that. How does that happen? Well, as Charles said, there's no single answer. It's one thing after another, though I went looking pretty hard for some commonalities. So I'm going to try to point to some things that seem to come up again and again in these instances. And so I've classified what I saw into a few categories of things that have stopped the Electoral College reform. One are things that are gone, that were important roadblocks at one point, but are no longer with us. There aren't many of those. One is a bigger set of things that are still with us, on top of the dominant status quo favorability towards keeping things the way they are, the difficulty of amending the Constitution. Some of those are transformations of things that are now gone. They have turned into something else and stuck with us. Then I'll mention a few new things that I think have emerged as roadblocks that were not in most of this history. And then just raise a couple puzzles about periods that look like opportunities where some reform should have happened and it didn't. And I'm not quite satisfied, at least by the chapters I read, as to why those opportunities didn't turn into reform. So what are the things that are gone in terms of roadblocks? One is an early argument that it would simply be too difficult to administer a popular election in a big country like ours. With its 13 states, or whatever the number was at the time, that would have simply been too challenging as an infrastructure. That argument, surprisingly, is not around any longer, as far as I know. There's a second resistance, or a second part, I think, of the movement towards reform that appears in the 1820s after the Jackson loss in 1824 to Adams, that Congress wanted out of the business of handling the contingency when the Electoral College did not choose a majority winner. Today, I don't hear members of Congress saying we don't want that power. I think they will gladly take that power. That's really the one instance where that comes up as a motivation. And so you get the Adams and Jackson supporters in Congress sort of on the wrong sides of the argument because they have different reasons for wanting to reform the Electoral College. And the third one, and the one that gets the most treatment in the book chapters, is about the uniqueness of the South in disenfranchising blacks, and there being a large black population there. And so that encouraged Southern politicians not to go along with any kind of national popular vote plan because it would have lessened their influence in the national decision. That's true when slavery is in place, through the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's true through Jim Crow and the white supremacy movements in the late 1800s. So it's not until you get to about the 1920s or 30s where that begins to not be the dominant factor, I would say. So those things are mostly gone. So what's still with us? One of the factors is that there's no agreement on what would replace the Electoral College, even if there is widespread dissatisfaction with it. As Congressman William McCullough is quoted in the book and says in 1969, after introducing multiple plans himself to reform the Electoral College, a proportional plan, a district plan, a national popular vote plan, he says, the disease is clear, but the remedy is not. So here are a bunch of plans. That doesn't do a lot to coordinate the actions of Congress on a single reform. In fact, the national popular vote doesn't become a focus as a main alternative until after the 1960s, really until the Civil Rights Movement and some other reforms take place. So it's not even clear whether the right strategy for reformers is to set this up as a battle between the existing system and the national popular vote. That's what was done in the House in 1969, and it got over 80% support, but it failed in the Senate. Is it better to, as a strategy, to have a menu of options and let them all be hashed out in the public sphere? Birch-Bayh tried that for a while and then backed away. President Nixon hedged as this battle was taking place in Congress. At one point, he supported a district plan or a proportional plan because it seemed like a middle path between the existing Electoral College and a national popular vote. So there was nothing principled about that. But would it have been better than the existing system? Would it have passed as an alternative? We don't know, and I just leave that as something for us to think about. Other things that are still with us are arguments for protecting small states who would lose influence, protecting federalism, which would be undermined, and generally protecting states' rights to organize themselves and their elections as they wish. Those arguments came around pretty late in U.S. history. It's really not until the late 1800s that you begin to see arguments in the press and from members of Congress in Alex's book for states' rights and protecting states. And most of that, I think he shows convincingly, is cover for white supremacy in the South. It's a superficial argument that seems logical and seems constitutional or legal or something else, but is really protection for some other lesser motives. In fact, small state representatives, small state newspapers, small state members of Congress were not arguing through most of American history that they would be penalized by moving to a popular vote. There were editorials quoted in the book from small state newspapers saying we're all in favor of a national popular vote. So it does make one wonder whether relying on the argument about small states and federalism and so on becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't based in fact. These were just assertions made by opponents of the national popular vote as to why we shouldn't go that direction, but it becomes something that then opponents begin to lean on, even though it wasn't something that actually originated the argument. So it's just a question as we think about reform today, what kinds of arguments are being lodged that are rooted in some falsehood from the past? Or are people leaning on that don't actually rely in fact? I'd remind people that New Hampshire and Iowa are two very small population states, get plenty of attention in the Electoral College. I'm from a medium population state. I'd be happy to give up my front row seat in next year's presidential election for a popular vote. Other things that are still with us, there were concerns, especially as the popular vote was being considered, about the variations in rules for suffrage across the states. Not just about African Americans in the South, but broader rules about the voting age. And whether the federal government would have to then be involved in setting federal standards to make sure there was a national election. That was something that held up reform in some cases. Today, I think that has flipped a bit. There is concern if, say, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact went into effect, that states might begin to loosen their rules for eligibility to vote in order to crank up support, right? That California might lower the voting age to 13 in order to get more Democratic votes into the national box. Or, and more seriously, the discussion about ex-felon voting rights in Florida or elsewhere.
Right.
If a state were interested in helping its side in the national total, it could change its rules. And without national intervention, there might actually be more variability in suffrage rules across the states. So early on, or as late as the 1970s, this was a concern about the feds coming in and forcing the states to adopt rules they didn't want. Now it's a concern about the feds not stopping the states from adopting rules that others might not have. Other things still with us as roadblocks. One is that Congress gets distracted. by other things. This is not a full-throated argument in the book, but it comes out from time to time. In the 1860s, after Lincoln's election, the Electoral College reform doesn't happen in part because the Congress is focused on impeachment of Johnson and Reconstruction, and that's going to take us a few decades. So their eyes are on something else. In the 1880s, when there were other scandalous elections, their eyes are on the economy and economic downturns and tariffs and other kinds of reforms. In the 1960s, when there is a lot of attention, nonetheless, Congress is distracted by Vietnam, race relations, an opening on the Supreme Court that ends up contaminating the battle in the Senate in 1970 and probably dooming it there by turning Southern Democrats against the reform. It's possible. It's possible that Congress gets distracted. They were distracted in the 60s, but it did in fact pass with majorities as a constitutional amendment in both chambers. And Congress has done other things around election reform despite being busy. I think there is a second concern here that maybe as part of this, there's always another presidential election looming. And if one is trying to fix the errors from the last election in time for the next one, Congress is not very well equipped to do all that in a timely fashion, right? And work through, if it's a constitutional process, work through the states afterwards. So at least some of these cases are Congress beginning to move in the direction of reform, seeing the next presidential election looming, and then backing away, saying there's not time to fix it. I wonder whether reformers today might agree that whatever reform is adopted would not go into effect until 1 or 2 or 3 presidential elections from now to take off some of that immediate pressure. Other things still with us, you probably need to make reform happen an entrepreneur who is willing to take this on as a cause, whether it's Seller or Boies or Lodge or Humphrey. These figures are there. You probably need an ally in the White House. Johnson and Nixon were sort of that in the 60s and 70s, but that helped. Frankly, it helped. You probably need a precipitating event, so please go create one. My view is that ranked choice voting in Maine happened for a lot of reasons. One reason is Paul LePage, who was viewed as an undesirable governor, elected through an undesirable process. Bush v. Gore led to a number of reforms, the Help America Vote Act and others, not the Electoral College. But you probably need an event, an entrepreneur, and these other things to all to fall right in place. One event that sort of works in a backwards way is George Wallace and his appearance in the '68 election, potentially costing Nixon the election, and a worry that that might bite Nixon more directly in '72. That probably helped Nixon get on board with some kinds of reforms and shape the votes of Southern senators who wanted to appease their constituents while making sure that Nixon didn't ruin things for them. The other general problem that is still with reformers is that the reformers' arguments are mostly about principles. It's just a good idea for each person to have equality in a national popular vote. But the opponents, who have the favorability of being with the status quo, can raise lots of concerns about the specific consequences, the details, and that's where it bogs down. Right? I think being on the side of principles is a good thing, but not being aware of or confronting those consequences all the time in advance is one thing that has hurt reformers. So those are things that are still with us that have not gone away, that are likely to inhibit reform. There are some things that are new that appeared after the chapters that I read. One is that these issues have become divided by party in a way that they were not in any of these earlier episodes. Not any of them. In most of them, these were factional battles of some Republicans and some Democrats working for reform, and some Republicans and some Democrats in the Congress working against reform. Today, it's mostly one party pushing for reforms and mostly one party on the other side. So we need more factions. Please help create those. There's also very little discussion of the filibuster or the structure of the Senate as being a roadblock. And maybe it was not in these earlier periods. It begins to appear in 1970 in the debate there, where Boies had to work through the filibuster to even get a vote, and then failed to get to 2/3. And in fact, he used the filibuster to his advantage at one point as well. But it strikes me that it has to be part of the discussion in Congress today. All right, so a couple last things. I think it seemed to me there were missed opportunities for reform in other eras where reforms were happening. And these struck me as dogs that did not bark, and I didn't have a full understanding of why that didn't happen. Think of the eras of massive electoral reform and other reforms in U.S. history. The progressive era, documented very nicely in the book, includes women's suffrage, the secret ballot, direct election of senators, and other things, some of those done by constitutional amendment. No real movement towards national popular vote or reform of the Electoral College at that time. In fact, from 1900 to 1910, there's not a single proposal in Congress to do away with the Electoral College as a constitutional amendment. The 1960s, there's reapportionment, obviously happens as a result of court decisions. The District of Columbia gets electoral votes, the Voting Rights Act passed, presidential nominations are reformed. Again, constitutional amendments all over the place, but not an immediate movement to reform the Electoral College, though that happens about 10 years later. So it doesn't look to me as though members of Congress or members of the public are averse to tinkering with the Constitution. We mess with it every so often in the name of making democracy better, but it hasn't happened with the Electoral College. This leaves the third missed opportunity, which is the period right after Bush v. Gore. Congress was distracted after 9/11, but it didn't stop it from enacting BICRA or HAVA or tax cuts. It was plenty busy legislating and could have focused on this. It's possible, I think, as someone said this morning, that working on HAVA actually ratified other parts of the electoral system, including the Electoral College. So there may be trade-offs between one set of reforms, as Sam mentioned, to deal with one set of problems, actually cements other institutions that we think are worthy of reform as well. Thank you.
Before turning this over to David, just a brief response to one things that Barry said. There is another chapter to the book that no one has read that goes from the period of 1980 till yesterday. And literally yesterday, and it does treat, Bush v. Gore and the partisan period. And now David Boies.
Well, if the function of political science is to generalize, the function of lawyers is to simplify. And so in terms of why we still have the Electoral College, particularly in the modern period, I think it is a confluence of two factors. In our politics, short-term almost always trumps long-term interest, and local almost always trumps collective interest. And you see that, I think, a lot in the obstacles to Electoral College reform now. And you saw that in the example that was mentioned earlier, the opposing positions of the Republican and Democratic parties in California and North Carolina. The reason that each state's dominant party likes winner-take-all is because it greatly advantages that party and greatly disadvantages the other party, not only in the presidential election, but in local and statewide elections. Because if you have a party that you know is going to win the presidential election, that tends to suck the energy out of the other party. And so whether you are the Republican Party in Alabama or the Democratic Party in California, you have an important interest in winner-take-all, because that solidifies and expands your power, not only in terms of the impact on your national presidential candidate, but in terms of your local interests as well. And in terms of short-term over long-term, the reason that you could get the 12th Amendment was that the party whose ox was gored was the majority party. What you had in the 1800 election is you had a dominant party whose will was being frustrated or potentially frustrated by the way the Electoral College worked. And so you had the confluence of an obvious problem together with that obvious problem disadvantaging the winner. What you have in more recent elections, where the person who gets the popular vote loses the Electoral College, is two things. One, you have a very divided country. It was much less divided in 1800 in terms of electoral results. Always hard to get anything done if you're seriously divided. Status quo almost always wins in that context. But more, at least as important, is that the person that was the party, the interest that was disadvantaged was the loser. And so when you don't have a dominant party who is being hurt by something, it's much harder to get that reform done. Now, if you think long-term, and this is why I think the suggestion that maybe you have an amendment that doesn't take place in terms of effectiveness for some period of time has a lot of value, is that I think people can know that political fortunes will ebb and flow. When winner-take-all was put in Massachusetts, it was put in to preserve Republican dominance, not Democratic dominance. It now serves to reinforce Democratic dominance at the national level. I think that people can focus on the fact that something may be better in the long term as long as it is not harmful to them in the short term. So that if you have a reform that people can understand is generally better, and you don't have to overcome the obstacle that people will think is going to be bad for me or my party in the short term, I think you have a greater chance for reform. Now, in terms of what kind of reform, I think it is absolutely true that the fact that there are different possible solutions to the Electoral College problem, in some senses, makes it more difficult. I think that from a personal standpoint, if you look at a solution that takes the Electoral College vote division and simply allocates that proportionally by state, you will solve a great many of the worst problems of the Electoral College. The two worst problems, I think, of the Electoral College is that A, it can give us a minority president, and B, it focuses attention on a handful of states, which has a number of distorting consequences. It excludes a lot of people, in effect, from the national election. It focuses the attention of the political leaders and the political candidates on issues that are peculiar to particular states. It discourages them from focusing on issues that may be very important to states that are not so-called battleground states. So I think those two problems are the real problems of the Electoral College. And those two problems would be largely solved by a solution that keeps the allocation of electoral votes the way it is now, which does distort to some extent based on state population. A voter in Montana obviously has a great deal more voting power in that sense than a voter in California. But that differential would rarely affect the two, what I think are the fundamental problems of the Electoral College. The areas where we have gotten minority presidents in the last couple of decades, are cases where if you had had proportional division, the winner of the electoral vote would have been the winner of the popular vote. It would be a very unusual case. It could happen, but it's a hard arithmetic model to predict that you're going to have a situation in which somebody would win the popular vote but lose the electoral vote with the electoral vote proportionally divided on a state-by-state basis. Second, if you divide the electors from each state based on the proportion of the vote, you do a number of things. First, you encourage candidates to go to a lot more states. If you talk about the interests, for example, of small states, nobody goes to Montana to campaign, or North Dakota or South Dakota. You would get some, maybe you wouldn't get the president, but you might get the vice president. You'd get more campaigning there because those votes would count now, whereas candidates know those votes don't count. And you obviously would get tremendously more presidential campaigning and presidential candidate attention to the issues that matter to states like New York, Massachusetts, California. So I think that a reform that divides electoral votes proportionally by the popular vote within the state solves what I think are the fundamental problems of the Electoral College. And at the same time, it avoids some of the issues that may be raised in terms of concern of if it's a national popular vote, does that encourage states to somehow manipulate the process to lower the voting age or not keep people who are not entitled to vote from voting? Are they trying to pack the vote? If you have a proportional division of electoral votes, you don't face that problem. So I think that, and in addition, while I agree that historically the small state bias of the Electoral College has not been a important obstacle to Electoral College reform, I'm not so sure that that's not true today. I'm not so sure that state legislators in Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota wouldn't be influenced by the fact that going to a national popular vote would very much reduce their the impact of their voters in terms of the national election. So I think, again, going to a proportional division of electoral votes solves that problem. Whether it's a significant problem or not, it's at least a potential problem. So I think that if you could get over the short-term bias and the local bias, you could divide those votes proportionally, I think that is that is a reform that might happen. We're trying to get the courts to implement that reform. The courts obviously cannot abolish the Electoral College, but there's nothing in the Electoral College, nothing in the Constitution that supports winner-take-all. And if you just look at normal constitutional principles that are applied and have been applied by the courts outside of the Electoral College presidential election context, where you have a two-step voting process where you have one political subdivision that votes, and then the people who are elected there vote for the next office, which is something that has happened in a number of cases historically. The courts have held that that is unconstitutional, violates the Equal Protection Clause, because what it does is it discards the votes of the losing people in the first phase. Obviously, if it's a single phase election, one party wins, one party loses. But when it's a two-step election like that, the courts have identified a serious equal protection problem in terms of winner-take-all results. So I think there's an analytical base, a sound legal analytical base to attack the winner-take-all aspects of the Electoral College. Whether a court is going to be prepared to do that or not, I think is something that we're finding out over the course of the next several years. But the real path to reform is to somehow convince the Congress and then the states that these aspects of the Electoral College, whatever its original purposes were, no longer exist. There's something on one of those walls where they have all the important statements by various jurists and people interested in the law outside. And one of them was a quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes that essentially says, it's a bad idea to do something just because it's been done for a long time. And it's a particularly bad idea to do it when the reasons for doing it originally have gone. And I think that applies to Electoral College.
Thank you. I'm not going to respond at this point, or I'm not going to take any time to respond to people who read my chapters of my book, except to say really thank you so much for your comments, and I really appreciate it. But I want to take what little remaining time we have to open it up to people who have been sitting patiently, quietly, and to whatever questions or comments you would like to put forward.
I just would want to echo David's comment, debating and disputing a bit the claim that the advantage of small states is not a significant factor. The case of Montana comes up. I happen to listen to the debate in Montana on the National Popular Vote Compact, and two propositions where we can theoretically have more campaign visits. On the opposing side is yes, but right now we're 4 times the power of vote in California. Would we be doing our constituents justice to remove that? And I clearly won the day, and I expect you would win the day in a lot of those.
Let me just say one thing in response to that, which is, I can't say that wouldn't happen, okay? What I can say is that many, if not most, of the leading advocates for a national popular vote in the 1960s and 1970s came from small states. William Langer of North Dakota was the most critical person. Mike Mansfield, who has been mentioned. John Pastore of Rhode Island. Okay, and opinion polls that we have from small states. Again, we're talking about pre-2016. The world may have just gone completely nuts since then, in all respects. But I'm not. Yes, that's true, but it hasn't always been a compelling reason. And the forces that make it a compelling reason or not, I think we need to try to unearth.
I just have a question about the proportional side of things, because I think there's lots of different ways about thinking about proportionality. So I just wondered, because and looking through this through the lens of the 2016 election and understanding there's counterfactuals about how campaigns operate and all that. But you can imagine a strict proportional system, which by my math would have given Clinton 265, Trump 261, Gary Johnson 10, and the race is then thrown to the House. So strict proportional in some ways, and probably in 1992, 1912, throws a lot more contingent elections to the House if you have pure proportionality. A second alternative might be you have sort of a floor of a 15% threshold, in which case in 2016 it would have been Clinton 270, Trump 267, McMullen 1, which is a pretty razor-thin margin in the Electoral College. Or an alternative might be to sort of marry a proportional representation system with sort of Ed's system of majoritarianism. You get 50%, you get all of it, you get below 50%, you sort of divide it up, and then it's Trump 277, Clinton 260, McMullen 1. So I just wonder, there's different ways of going about it, but I'm particularly worried about the House contingent election outcome, or one by one.
I don't, when we talk about proportion, we're not talking about, proportional in the sense that you have in some countries where if you get enough to have one vote, you get that one vote. I think you would have a floor, or you could have just it divided among the top 2 candidates. So I think that you're 100% right. You wouldn't want to have a situation where everybody could run, and if you got 5% of the votes in California, you'd get a couple of electors. But you'd either you could have a floor, or you could have it just among the top 2 and divide the electoral things proportionally among those 2, in proportion to each of their votes compared to the other.
With all this arithmetic, like these numbers that you just gave are in fact correct. I think a 270 to 268 electoral vote outcome in 2016 would probably have been contentious.
Yes, Barry, you exhorted everybody who's listening to create factions and precipitating events. And yet the panel immediately preceding you used all kinds of nomenclature about spoilers and threats and third parties and whatnot. So how do you balance what you heard this morning with what you're asking all viewers to do?
Well, I don't want to encourage chaos, so we don't need more factions and more events in that sense. But I think the history makes clear that you need those things as part of the stew that leads to some significant movement. Take Nixon, who was on board with some kind of reform in the late 60s, early 70s. He's worried about George Wallace coming back and winning a bunch of southern states and ruining his southern strategy and letting the Democrats knock him out of office. So that, that's maybe an unsavory part of American politics, the George Wallace vote, but it actually made a discussion happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So I don't know that we can predict these things. There are certainly events and factions that don't lead to serious movement towards reform. So they're not a sufficient condition, but they seem like a necessary condition, at least for the instances that I read about.
So the successful constitutional reforms that you mentioned to improve our democracy, lowering the voting age, granting women the right to vote, etc., they all have this virtue of people can point to the people who are disenfranchised, 19-year-olds, women, and then saying, let's give them the right to vote, and those people themselves can organize. That's obviously very difficult with electoral college reform. There's no one group that you can say, these are the people we're harming. So I'm curious, for the folks that have read the chapters, how did they get closest in explaining to the public and explaining to House members, these are the people who are really being harmed, and we need to do that? What's the best messaging there that is akin to, let's grant those people the right to vote now?
I think the best messaging in terms of a national popular vote, I mean, again, it's different if you're talking about districting in the 19th century or, proportional really emerges as an alternative to districting because of gerrymandering. That's where the idea comes from in the late 19th century. But, the messaging that I mean, I'm not a specialist in interpreting messaging, but that seemed to work best and was most straightforward was all votes should count equally. And that everybody's vote should count the same. And, it's not a coincidence that the shift of reform energy towards favoring a national popular vote rather than proportional or districts is really propelled in part by the court's apportionment decisions, the one person, one vote decisions in the 1960s, even though those decisions explicitly disclaimed any relationship to the Senate or the Electoral College. But it became, if you read the newspapers, from the magazines from the mid to late 1960s, it's all over the place. I think the fairness principle argument was always the most compelling.
Can I just add one thing? One of the tricky features when Barry was talking earlier, and I think made a very good point about how Congress gets distracted, and that plays an important role in Alex's narrative. It's important to remember that in a world with presidential coattails, or just some kind of partisan, unity to the vote, the aggrieved after an electoral college loss, which may be accompanied by a popular vote victory, are going to be the people who are out of power. I mean, this is pretty obvious, but they're going to be out of power in the near term, at least in the White House. And usually those incoming presidents have at least one chamber with them. So you're talking about a world in which any kind of loyalty to the president or to a legislative program is probably going to prevent any kind of action occurring nationally at the federal level for at least 2 years. And then what are the kinds of things that bring electoral, or what are the kinds of things that bring reversals of majorities in, say, midterm elections? It's usually not, I'm gonna generalize here for a moment, it's usually not electoral reform. It's something about the economy, it's the Iraq War, it's a range of other things. So this phenomenon of agenda crowding, I think, is real. That it recedes in population, or excuse me, recedes in prominence as one gets further away from the loss, the source of the folks who are aggrieved by the loss, which is why it's all the more important for a conference like this to be held, to keep it on the potential winner's agenda, so that they don't forget, because there's gonna be a million other things, whether it's Medicare for all or things that are gonna be on that potential next Congress's agenda, right? And I think it's very important for intellectuals, activists, and others to kind of hold parties' feet to the fire on those issues. Another source of the reason to buy Alex's book.
There are many reasons to do that.
Yes.
But I am also, I have committed myself to the powers that be, that we would end on time. And we are at the witching hour, perhaps even 30 seconds over. And not only that, we stand between you and lunch. So let me thank all of the participants for their really very valuable contribution.